On this channel, we often mention the massive leaps and bounds forensic science has taken in the last few decades. Tools like the MVAC system and genealogy testing have brought answers to hundreds of cold cases that nobody ever thought would be solved. But it's also worth noting that there are still thousands of cases waiting to see justice. Join us for today's episode as we examine 3 chilling cases that are still unsolved in 2025. Amber Hagerman. 9-year-old Amber Hagerman was last seen riding her bike around Arlington, Texas on January 13th, 1996. She had spent the day with her younger brother Ricky, riding around on their bikes, having left their grandmother's house at around 1:30 p.m. that afternoon. The siblings' grandmother had warned them to stay close, and they always did. However, after riding around the car park of an abandoned Winn-Dixie grocery store, Ricky decided to go home without his older sister because she wanted to stay out longer. When Ricky returned with his grandfather a short time later, there was no sign of Amber, only her pink bicycle, lone and abandoned. Arlington police would later tell the media outlets that a witness had seen the little girl being taken. Quote, "He described the suspect carrying Amber in that same position as she kicked and screamed to his truck, putting her inside the driver's side door." The witness was an elderly man named Jimmy Kevill. He saw the black pickup truck pull up and noted that it had been parked at a nearby laundromat before Amber was taken. The perpetrator was described as being white or Hispanic, in his 20s or 30s, and under 6 feet tall with dark hair. Police believe that he was a local to the area. After witnessing the terrifying event, Jimmy called the police. In the following days, law enforcement searched for the little girl. The pickup truck seen at the time of her abduction had headed towards the center of Arlington, but there was no sign of her. 4 days later, on January 17th, her body was finally found. A man walking his dog late that night found her lying in a creek behind an apartment complex. Amber's clothes were missing, and severe laceration wounds were found on her neck. She was just 5 miles from where she was last seen, and her estimated date of death was January 15th. One police detective recalled the tremendous amount of violence used in the murder. Quote, "Amber was totally nude except for a sock on her left foot. We rolled her over and I caught her head in my hands. Several lacerations to the throat. A knife or screwdriver had been used to rip her throat out." While her family grieved, one local mother had an idea. She suggested to a radio station that a national alert system for missing children be created, which subsequently led to the creation of the Amber Alert, with Amber being short for America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response. The alert system was launched in 1996, and today works by broadcasting the missing child's information via the likes of digital billboards, transportation signs, text messages, and Facebook alerts. It has contributed to the recovery of 1,221 children, according to the official Amber Alert website. The website also states that such alerts serve as a deterrent for child predators and have led to the release of some children after the perpetrator heard the Amber Alert. Though it has been nearly 3 decades since Amber went missing, investigators have stated that the case is still active. Arlington Police Sergeant Grant Gilden told People, "We continue to have leads, and there are still several leads that we continue to investigate extensively as possible suspects. A lot of people will refer to Amber's case as what's commonly referred to a cold case, but for the Arlington Police Department, it has never been listed as a cold case because we've never gone 180 days without having some lead come in." Amber's case has received over 7,000 tips, and in 2021, investigators reported that they had DNA evidence that may belong to Amber's killer. But despite this, her killer remains at large. Police believe that there are witnesses who didn't come forward at the time but may have relevant information. If you have any information about Amber's case, you can call the tip line, which was established shortly after she went missing, at 817-575-8823. Alternatively, you can call Crime Stoppers of Tarrant County anonymously at 817-469-8477. Vicki Lee Lamberton. Vicki Lee Lamberton grew up in Harper, Kansas, but by all accounts seemed to harbor feelings of shame around her upbringing and often told people she was raised in Colorado instead. During her late teens, while attending Union College in Nebraska, Vicki met Lowell Lamberton, who was her professor. The pair quickly struck up a romantic relationship, moving to Worcester in 1968 and marrying in 1969. At the time of her disappearance in 1974, Vicki, now 24, was on her way to obtaining her master's degree in psychology. She was studying at Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts, and with the help of her professor, Dr. Roger Barker, had visited New York City to apply for her psychology doctorate at Columbia University. But not all was thriving in Vicki's life. She had separated from her husband in January, and Lowell suspected that she was, in fact, having a relationship with her married professor. In early February, she moved out of the home she was sharing with one of her brothers, Robert, and moved her belongings into Robert Barker's garage. Lowell and Robert later saw her shopping with her professor, cementing the idea further that the pair were romantically involved. But despite this, sometime in February, Vicki reached out to her estranged husband. Over the phone, they discussed the idea of rekindling their relationship. Vicki suggested that they might meet up when she returned from a weekend trip to Maine she was taking with one of her friends, and said she would call him upon her return. But Lowell never heard from her again. Alarm bells began to ring when Vicki didn't get in touch after that weekend. When Lowell contacted Vicki's friends, he discovered that no such trip had been planned. The friends stated, in fact, that she hadn't spoken to Vicki recently. Upon hearing this, Lowell decided to visit Roger Barker at Assumption College to ask if he knew where Vicki had gone. However, Barker wasn't present. Staff at the university informed Lowell that he had spent the weekend on a skiing trip in Vail, Colorado, and that he'd been hospitalized with pneumonia, which delayed his return home. His wife had reportedly returned to Massachusetts without him. Lowell pressed on anyway and visited Barker in March, about 1 month after Vicki was last heard from. Barker agreed that he'd stored her belongings for her, but said that he didn't know Vicki particularly well and was unaware of her whereabouts. Furthermore, he implied that the 24-year-old was romantically entangled with someone else, although he did not seem to know who, or at least he didn't share much information. Details into the investigation into Vicki's disappearance are non-existent because there was never an original investigation. The 24-year-old was not reported missing until 36 years later, in 2010, with many family members stating their belief that she'd met someone new and had left to start afresh. Lowell noted that Vicki had mentioned the idea of leaving her old life behind sometime before she went missing, specifically stating that she wanted to go someplace where nobody knows who I am. She also discussed changing her skin color. Notably, photographs of Vicki online show her looking drastically different, from having cropped beach blonde hair to a reddish mullet-style haircut to a very dark bob, perhaps suggesting the idea that she sought to change her looks and escape her old life. Her date of disappearance is listed as February 1st, though her husband heard from her at some point after this in February, and although her brothers decided to retrieve her belongings from Barker's garage about a year after she went missing, nothing useful was ever found. Barker continued to deny knowing anything about her disappearance during this time. Sometime after her disappearance, the man who lived on Vicki's family's old farmstead received a peculiar call telling him that the 24-year-old had gone to Europe. The caller also asked for Lowell's number. By the time of the phone call, Vicki's family had moved to Texas. Interpol reported that there was no record of her having been to Europe. One of her brothers, Brent, wondered, where did the person get the phone number? He believes that Vicki herself may have been behind the phone call. In 1980, 6 years after she went missing, one of Vicki's brothers tracked down one of her friends. The friend stated that she'd last heard from Vicki on the night she'd called Lowell. She explained that she was going to Colorado with Roger Barker for the weekend and mentioned the possibility of the pair getting married, though the Charlie Project notes that Barker already had a wife. Vicky stated that she'd called her friend when she returned, but she never heard from the 24-year-old again. Notably, Vicky's driver's license has never been renewed, and her social security number has never been used since she went missing. As of 2012, Lowell maintained his belief that his wife had left to start anew and that she was still alive. He moved to Oregon sometime after Vicky went missing and remarried in 1991, almost 20 years later. He died in 2021, never knowing what became of his first wife. Vicky's brother Robert worked tirelessly to chase down leads and try to find her, but he died in 2009 without finding the truth. Vicky was, at one point, suspected of being the Lady of the Dunes, who has now been identified as Ruth Marie Terry. She has been ruled out as a match for the Virginia Beach Jane Doe, a woman whose dismembered remains were found in Virginia Beach in 1976. Vicky Lamberton is still missing. She was 24 when she vanished from Worcester, Massachusetts, in February of 1974. She is described as a white woman with light brown hair and brown eyes. She is 5 foot 3 inches tall and weighed about 110 pounds at the time of her disappearance. If she is still alive, she will be 75 years old. She may use her maiden name, Lockwood. If you have any information about her disappearance, you can contact the Worcester Police Department at 508-799-8651. Richard Colvin Cox. 21-year-old Richard Colvin Cox was last seen on January 14, 1950. Born in 1928 in Mansfield, Ohio, Richard volunteered for the U.S. Army after leaving high school. He was successfully recruited and underwent his basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, before being assigned to the U.S. Constabulary, where he spent time in Germany and reached the rank of sergeant. In 1948, he attended the U.S. Military Academy Preparatory School in West Point, New York, and was found to be an academically gifted student, ranking 100th out of 550. On the surface, it seemed that Richard was doing well in life. He was performing well in school, voted his cadet company's top cadet, and even became engaged to his girlfriend, Betty Timmons. His only known complaint was that he didn't particularly enjoy life at prep school, something he discussed in letters to his family. On the day of his disappearance, January 14, 1950, Richard attended a basketball game which pitted Rutgers University's Scarlet Knights against the Army's Black Knights. Shortly afterwards, he was seen talking to a man who was described by witnesses as looking dark-haired and rough-looking. Following this, Richard returned to his room and told his roommate that he was signing out because he was dining with a visitor, with the roommate recalling that the 21-year-old seemed not apprehensive, just sort of disgusted. He left with the aforementioned visitor and was never seen again. The man Richard had been talking to was initially thought to be someone named George. George first entered the case on Saturday, January 7th, about 1 week before the disappearance. At 5:45 that afternoon, Peter Haynes, Richard's classmate, who was acting as charge of quarters in Cadet Company B2, Richard's company, received a phone call from someone looking to speak with the 21-year-old. The caller was described as having a tone that was rough and patronizing, almost insulting. When they were told by Peter that Richard wasn't in his room, the caller stated, "Well, look, when he comes in, tell him to come down here to the hotel. Just tell him George called. He'll know who I am. We knew each other in Germany. I'm just up here for a little while, and tell him I'd like to get him a bite to eat." Peter would later state that he wasn't 100% sure the name he'd been given was George, because he'd answered so many phone calls that day while on duty, and this specific call had not seemed particularly important at the time. 45 minutes later, a man entered Great Hall, which was an area of the school where cadets could meet guests. The on-duty cadet telephoned Richard to let him know he had a visitor. The man was described as being just under 6 feet tall and weighing around 185 pounds. He had fair hair and a light complexion and wore a belted trench coat and no hat. Richard soon arrived at the hall and shook hands with the man. The on-duty cadet, who observed the interaction, stated that Richard seemed pleased to see the fair-haired stranger. Richard subsequently signed out in order to take his visitor to dinner at the Thayer Hotel, located on campus grounds. However, he later told his roommates that the pair didn't go out to eat. Instead, they drank whiskey while sitting in the man's car. He returned later that evening, where he took a shower and had a nap. A short time later, he altered the time he'd written in the departure book, changing 1923 to 1823, to make it appear as if he had attended the 6:30 p.m. cadet super formation, even though in reality he had skipped it. Notably, this fabrication wasn't noted until 1952, when the book was forensically examined. Had this deception been discovered by his superiors, Richard would have been charged with violating the cadet honor code. Bizarrely, later that night, at 10:30 p.m. when lights out was announced, Richard's roommates were startled when he woke up, ran out into the hallway, and shouted what sounded like Alice. When asked who Alice was, Richard didn't respond. Instead, he went back to bed and promptly fell asleep. His roommates wondered if Alice was the name of a sweetheart he had before meeting Betty, but there was never any evidence to support this idea. The following day, Richard told his roommates about the man who'd visited him, whom he never referred to by name. He stated that he was a former US Army Ranger who'd served in his unit in Germany. The man had a tendency to gloat about killing German troops during World War II, and often gleefully boasted about how he'd cut off their genitalia afterwards. The man also claimed to have impregnated a German girl, whom he then hanged to prevent her from having the baby. Richard met up with this man a little bit later, returning to his room at 4:30 p.m. He reportedly told his roommates that he hoped he wouldn't have to see the fellow again. This led them to understand that Richard didn't particularly like the man, although it's unclear why they continued to meet. Notably, the description given of this man is drastically different from the one seen talking to Richard at the basketball game. The George who'd visited him on campus was tall and blonde, compared to the dark-haired and rough-looking description given by witnesses of the encounter at the basketball game. Richard's absence was noted at 11 o'clock on the night of January 14th, and again at 2:30 a.m., but because cadets were occasionally known to stay out late, even past curfew, no action was taken. It wasn't until the following morning that his disappearance was taken seriously. His roommates raised the matter with their superior, and this time, CID and the New York State Police were both notified. The FBI later became involved with the case. A public appeal for information in the disappearance was made just 3 days after Richard vanished. A ground and air search of campus grounds was carried out, and numerous bodies of water, including a local pond, the Hudson River, and Lusk Reservoir, were extensively searched, but no sign of the missing cadet was found. The search for Richard lasted 2 months, but investigators had no evidence to show for their efforts. Using what they'd learned from his roommates, authorities attempted to track down George, but were unable to do so, as those who matched the description were found to have watertight alibis. Richard's time in Germany was closely examined, but produced no new leads, and the theory that he left voluntarily was abandoned because he left the equivalent of over $1,100 in today's money, as well as his civilian clothes and other possessions. One psychologist on the campus suggested that Richard was gay or bisexual in an attempt to explain why 2 single men met up so regularly. The FBI then decided to visit gay bars in New York City, looking for men who matched the description of George and showing Richard's photograph to regulars and staff. However, nobody recognized his image or the description of George. Over the next few years, there were several unconfirmed sightings of Richard. One such sighting didn't emerge until 2021, over 70 years after the disappearance. A high school classmate of his named Ursula saw him just days after he went missing. She was walking on 4th Street in Mansfield, Ohio, when she saw him walking along the railroad tracks. She stated that she recognized him immediately because of his distinctive gait. The pair waved at one another, with Ursula assuming that he'd just gotten off the train at Union Station nearby, and she waited for the passing train between them to move so she could approach him. However, by the time the train had moved on, Richard was gone. She stated that she never reported the sighting because she didn't want to jeopardize his life or career, believing that he'd possibly gone to work for an intelligence agency. She added that she didn't want this sighting to be made public until her death, speculating that at such a time it would be safe for the sighting to be revealed and would avoid upsetting Richard's life. In respect of her wishes, the writer who made the sighting public did not do so until Ursula passed away in 2020. Another sighting occurred just 4 years after Richard went missing. Ernest Shotwell, who'd attended the military prep school at the time, told the FBI that he'd bumped into the missing cadet in 1954 at a Greyhound bus station in Washington, D.C. He simply assumed by this point that Richard was no longer a missing person. Richard reportedly told Ernest that he'd left the school and was moving to Germany. Ernest surmised that he was living nearby because he was dressed in light clothing despite the cold weather. Furthermore, he recalled that Richard seemed uncomfortable to see him and was very vague about his life and his plans. He apparently departed after just 5 minutes. By the late 1950s, the FBI deemed the investigation closed. They'd followed all the leads and tips, and it had led nowhere. Richard's family had him declared dead in 1957. Still, despite this, the agency occasionally continued to follow up on sightings and potential leads. In 1960, an FBI informant believed he'd seen Richard and spoken with him at a bar in Melbourne, Florida. Acquaintances called him Richard, while he introduced himself as R.C. Mansfield. He apparently revealed information that lined up with Richard's life, and even stated that Mansfield was not his real surname, but Cox was. Some of the things he told the informant suggested that he was working for an American intelligence agency, but although the FBI searched for such a man, they were never able to find him. Many of the theories pertaining to Richard's disappearance conclude that he joined an intelligence agency. This was the conclusion of a reporter named Jim Underwood, who wrote about the case in 1982. He spoke with a high school classmate of Richard's, who later became a prosecutor and had connections with the FBI. The old classmate told Underwood that he had learned from one agent that they had come close to arresting Richard, but had been ordered not to pick him up, leaving them to speculate that he was undercover or working in intelligence. The classmate also stated that for years he had requested to see the case files for himself, but excuses were always made, and by the time he was finally able to access them, the majority of the reports were redacted. A retired high school teacher named Marshall Jacobs also spent time looking into the disappearance in the 1980s. He learned that Richard had written to a woman he'd met in Germany, asking about Soviet activities in the country, though the letter was returned as undeliverable. Furthermore, an American man named John H. Noble, who was captured and imprisoned by the Soviets between 1945 and 1955, claimed that a prisoner by the name of Cox was being held in Siberia. Meanwhile, the FBI informant who'd bumped into R.C. Mansfield in Florida was also deemed to have been credible, given the information they supplied about Richard's life. Still, whatever happened to Richard is unknown over 7 decades later. Likewise, George has never been identified. The closest investigators came to the identification was when they discovered that a man named Robert Frisbee was stationed at Fort Knox at the same time as Richard. He matched the description of George and was known to have sold fake IDs in New York City in the 1950s. Investigators speculated that Richard had attempted to gain one in order to disappear voluntarily. Frisbee was arrested for murder in 1985 and stated that he didn't know Richard and had never done business with him. Marshall Jacobs, meanwhile, concluded that a man named David Westervelt, who served with Richard in Germany, was George. Westervelt fit the physical description and was interviewed several times about the disappearance by police at the time. Notably, Jacobs believed that Westervelt was a recruiter for the CIA. He believed that Richard voiced his unhappiness at the military school and that he'd been offered a way out, which involved him leaving behind everything and everyone he knew and changing his name. This way out was likely to work with the CIA or another intelligence agency. In the mid-1990s, Jacobs further learned from a retired CIA official that Richard was allegedly part of a team in Europe who worked to smuggle high-priority officials out of the Soviet Union. He later retired to Idaho, but was then diagnosed with a terminal illness. At the time of the account, he was reportedly at the National Institutes of Health facility in Bethesda, Maryland. According to a report by the Times-Union, however, even Jacobs himself admitted that there are holes in the story and contradictory information floating around. Writers and online sleuths have also noted the strangeness of recruiting a young man who was ranked only 100th out of 550 students, as opposed to picking someone from the top 10. Odder still is having him suddenly disappear one day, drawing attention to him and leading to his photograph to be printed in newspapers all across the country. Adding to the mystery is that many of the CID and FBI files that Jacobs obtained contain redacted information that's impossible to figure out, in the same way that Richard's classmate had mentioned, and over 160 pages are missing from the files. Jacobs later contacted Harry Mayhafer, a graduate of the school Richard attended, who'd become a history writer later in life. The pair worked on a book about the disappearance together, in which Harry noted that even Jacobs has accepted the fact that neither he nor anyone else would ever know the full story. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.